In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a proper in-text citation from an article from one of the college's databases. And I'm going to be using these two database articles here, which I already have done the works cited entries for. And I'm going to run through a couple common scenarios here that you will probably run into. So let's go to the first article here, and let's just pick out a quote that we might want to use. I'm going to just pick out these two sentences here. They look good to me. And I'm going to go to this paper here, which I'm going to pretend is my essay. So in-text citations are citations that go inside the paragraphs of the essay, right? So when you're putting a quote in your essay, or you're referring to a fact, an example, a number that you got from a source, you would use an in-text citation, which is of course different from the works cited entry because they're all on that last works cited page. This would be inside your essay. So I'm going to pull the quote in there, and of course I'll put quotation marks around that because that's a direct quote. And I want to put a signal phrase in front of the quote because you always want to introduce a quote with a signal phrase. You never want a sentence that's just a quote by itself. So in a situation like this where you have an article with an author, right? So the article's author is the first word of the works cited entry, then it's very common to just use the author in the signal phrase and you'll match the first word of the works cited entry, which is very important to do. So I'm going to say, as David Kreutzer explains, and I'll introduce it that way. And now I have that keyed system working because the first word of my entry is now in my signal phrase. And so I've done a correct in-text citation because the reader of my essay will see this name and be able to find it easily because it's the first word of one of the works cited entries. Some people wonder, well, what do I put in the parentheses then? Well, usually in a database article, when you introduce it with a signal phrase, you don't have any parentheses because most of them aren't page numbered. That would be the only thing left to put in the parentheses if you had an author in the signal phrase. So it's very, very common to just have a signal phrase with the author introducing the quote and just ending with period, quote mark, and that's it. All right, so that's probably the most common kind of scenario. An authored article where you can just put the author's name right in the signal phrase and then give the quote or the fact if you're paraphrasing it. All right, but what if we have something different? And I have another article here that doesn't have an author, right? If you look at the works cited entry for that, it just begins with this title. So what do we do there? Well, one thing for sure is we've got to match the first words of this entry somewhere in our in-text citation, right? So let's pick out a quote and see how we can make that happen. So I'm just going to pick something here. This is sort of a quote that looks good to me, and I'm going to put that inside my essay. And of course, this is a direct quote, so I'll put quote marks around it. So what I could do is put the title in the signal phrase, and if it's a main title or subtitle, I could just use the first part. So I could say, And of course, I need to sort of make that flow so it's not clear what it is. So I need to put that in here, which is opioid addiction. So I'll just put that in there and then start my quote a little later. So you could do that. That's one way to do it. I think the more common way to put in an in-text citation for an article with no author, though, is to put the publication name in the signal phrase and then the title words in the parentheses. It's a little smoother, as you'll see. So what was the original publication here? Kirkus Reviews, right? So what I could do here is say, as Kirkus Reviews suggests, and of course it's a journal, so it has to be in italics. That's kind of the more typical thing because it's a little smoother rather than trying to put a title in, especially if it's a big long title, then that gets to be really awkward. But I still have to match the first words of the entry, which is "This is Ohio." So I'm going to need to put that in somewhere, and one place I can put it is in the parentheses. So I'm going to get rid of that period there because now I'm going to have a period at the end of the parentheses, and I'm going to have "This is Ohio" in my parenthetical in-text citation. And notice I have kept the quotation marks. A lot of people forget to do that, and you really need to keep the quotation marks around the title. So in this version, I put the original publication name in the signal phrase just to make it flow a little better, but then I made sure I still had the first words of the entry in my parentheses, right? So that would be a scenario for an article that doesn't have an author. Let's do one last scenario that's a little more rare, but it does come up, and that's when you want to quote something that is itself quoted in your article. So there's a guy named Jack Schuler, right? He's mentioned up here too, who is quoted quite a bit in this article, right? As Schuler notes, and then we get a quote there and some other quotes here. What if you wanted to use that, the quote that's inside the article? Well, you can still do that, but there's a specific way you cite that. So this is one of Jack Schuler's quotes that looks good to me. So I'm going to use it, and I'll put it in my essay here. Now, when you introduce the quote with a signal phrase, of course, you want to do the common sense thing, which is to say who actually said those words. And the person who said those words is Schuler, right? Because he was quoted as saying this inside the article. So you need to state that in the signal phrase, right? Jack Schuler argues that, many addicts could be saved, right? Because he's the one who said those words. So whoever said the words that you're quoting, you put it in the signal phrase, right? When it's a matter of citing a quote from an article. But we still have to match the first word of that article, don't we? And it came from "This is Ohio." So we still need to match that. So here's how we do that. We will use a little notation called quoted in, QTD period space in period, all lowercase, and then "This is Ohio," preserving the quotation marks. That's called an indirect quote. It's indirect because you're not quoting the author of the article. You're quoting somebody that the author of the article himself or herself quoted and put in their article. And in that situation, you have whoever said the words of the quote in the signal phrase, and then quoted in, and the first words of the article that it came from. And you know, if this had come from Kreutzer's article, we would do that, right? We would say, quoted in Kreutzer if it came from there, right? It doesn't have to come from an article that begins with a title. It could also come from an article that begins with an author. But of course, we know in this case that it came from, this is Ohio. All right. Now, one warning I want to give you, don't put quoted in every single citation you have. If you're doing that, something's wrong, because this is somewhat rare. So you only do it when you're quoting someone who is themselves quoted in the article you're using. So I would say that if you're using the quoted in notation for more than about 10% of your quotes, there's probably something wrong. You know, you probably need to check and say, is this really something that was quoted in that article, or is it just from the article itself? Because if it's just the words of the article itself, you'll do like this, right? You don't need to quote it in because Kreutzer's the one who said these words. He wrote the article. It's just here, the person who wrote the article, the writer of This Is Ohio, is quoting Jack Schuler. So those are some typical scenarios that will come up when you're doing an in-text citation from a database article from one of the college's databases.